Welcome to today's event. My name is Joss Colchester. I'm from the Systems Innovation London Hub. And today we're going to be talking systems change and how to scale it, how to scale a systems innovation. A very interesting topic indeed. One I'm very much interested in myself and have read quite a bit about. I actually produced a guide on this very topic. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in a minute. But we're very fortunate to be joined by Lennart Woltering, calling in all the way from Mexico. Great to have you here. He's going to be talking a little bit, give you a presentation, hopefully. I'm going to say a few words about our guide and some of the ideas we have on our website around systems, scaling systems change, and then hopefully have a bit of a discussion. Today's event should be about an hour. So Lennart Woltering, he's part of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. He has more than 15 years of experience in agriculture and rural development, particularly at the water, food, energy nexus, dealing with climate change, climate adaptation on different continents. I think he's worked in Africa. He's now obviously working in Latin America, Central America. Particularly his work revolves around water resource management and food systems. So that's where he's kind of drawing a lot of his experience from when he's talking about trying to scale systems innovations. So I'm going to leave it over to you, Lennart, to take away with your presentation, and then we'll come back. I'll do a little presentation. We'll hopefully have a discussion. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them into the chat as we go along. And maybe we'll open up when we get to the end, and you'll be able to ask any questions when we get to there. Also, I'll just say today's event is being live streamed, so it's being recorded. But yeah, over to you, Lennart.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joss. It is 6:30 in the morning here in Mexico City, so my face still has to find the shape of the day. So probably by the end of the hour, I look a little bit different than I look now, but so just bear with me. Let me try to share my screen. There we go. All right. Do you see my screen properly? Right. Good. Yeah. Thanks so much for this invitation to talk to you, and thanks for all of you to take your time to be here and be part of this discussion. I'll be talking about scaling innovations. As Joss was saying, I work for the CGIR, which is a difficult name, but it's a global research partnership for a food secure future. It's really about sustainable development goals. It's about food security. It's about poverty alleviation. I spent also most of my career in Africa. It's a joint position supported by the German Development Corporation. So again, development projects in Africa and other countries. And I'm also a chair of the agricultural working group of the Scaling Community of Practice, which I will also come back to. So I'm drawing a little bit from these sources today. If you talk about sustainable development goals and hunger and poverty, it's an emotional issue. I think even 2 days ago, Elon Musk was saying, okay, if I give you 6 billion, can you solve this, right? So there's a lot of pressure on basically making it happen. No? Okay, scale those fantastic innovations that improve the well-being of people, and then we end with this hunger and poverty. We won't see any more poor children on TV. So there's a lot of pressure to get this done. And so this is kind of what is then meant with scaling, scaling the business impact, scaling sustainable financial goals. There's a lot of word, the word is everywhere, especially I think in the last 5 years, it's skyrocketed. It's scaled, if you want to say. The thing is that we're not very good at it. There's a lot of research showing that we're really not so successful, not only in agriculture, but also in health, in urban development, but also beyond that, also in startups, in other businesses. The reality is often that projects do very well during the project lifetime, and then they go down. So this is a picture from Honduras, and it's actually quite a rare picture because often you see the graphs going up, and then the graph ends, and you're basically felt to believe that everything extrapolates further. So it was kind of a discovery to find this figure from our colleagues that were working in Honduras, where they show kind of the measures that they're taking to improve the soil and water conservation. Actually, they go down drastically after the project. And this is a typical picture. It's 95% estimated do not really scale up to make this impact. They basically cease to exist, right, after the project ends. And we draw a few lessons from that, because basically the work that I'm doing is focusing on scaling. Basically, I'm on my name tag, it's a scaling expert. So the focus is on that. There are a few important lessons I would like to highlight here. First of all, is the context is king. And one of the things to shock a little bit the colleagues always is to say, okay, we as scientists, 10% is the innovation, 90% is the context. And there are two aspects to this. One is this strong drive to have, basically the way that we work is through projects, right? You get funding from a donor, you do a 3-4 year project. And those projects are always happening in very controlled environments. You send in external experts that are well paid. You get budgets for a finite amount of time with a starting date and an end date. Projects are often shielded from the reality. There's a donor behind it who is making sure that that the project is implemented well, despite maybe the government issues in Kenya or Malawi and other countries, right? So we often see this, that people say, we have a fantastic pilot project, it's ready to go to scale. But yeah, that's a wholly different context, of course, no? The second element to that contextual issue is a bit closer to the innovation, is that the idea that there are no silver bullets. And it's kind of interesting to see that still everybody says it, but still, if you look at what's going on, there's still a lot of action going in a direction, basically believing that. No? So it is about having a core innovation, let's say, that particular seed, for example, that is resilient to droughts, maize seed, for example, resilient to droughts. But that doesn't really work that well. You don't think about the fertility of the soil. It doesn't work that well also if you don't think about the market. So all the innovations, they come with supplementary innovations that also need to scale at the same time. So in that sense, this figure is kind of wrong. It's not one lamp that goes out. No, there are many that have to go out depending on the context. If you would do the scaling of such a seed, for example, in India or in Benin, it's a world of difference, and you need very different supplementary innovations to support that process. So it's really about the context, the context in which we work, but also the context around the innovation. The second lesson is that scaling is a process. And what we often see is that scaling is an end. I think the figure that I showed before, the first one with the graph going up, probably, highly likely, the project objective was to scale that innovation until the end of the project, until December 31st, right? So everything was put in practice to make sure that that happened, that goal is achieved. It's kind of like scaling is the end in itself. Whereas that really borrows a lot from the Industrial Revolution thinking. It borrows a lot from Silicon Valley kind of quick startups and reach more is better kind of thinking. Whereas where we are working here is it's a public research institution, public research consortium. So we have to go also focus on the public good, right? You have to think about the implications of scaling for women or social inclusion. You have to think about the environment and other things. So in that sense, the scaling becomes a means to an end. No, the end is probably a healthier people or better livelihoods in those communities. And that may be because of that innovation, but also may not be, right? And I think in that sense, we have to really think differently about scaling from, okay, more is better and maximum scale for a few, to really thinking about an optimal scale for many, right? A classical example is, of course, work on solar-powered irrigation. Is that is fantastic for many farmers. But if a lot of farmers do it, the groundwater resources will drain drastically. And if you look at other people that are using that same water or depend on that water for the water tables in their lakes or for fishery or for drinking even, you probably would say there are other projects fighting that irrigation project, right? So it's really about having those things in mind and really seeing the scaling of that innovation in the context of really solving the problem, right? Another important idea there is that when something scales up, something else scales down. And this is very nice research from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, looking at scaling rubber in China. And you say, yeah, okay, if you do this, the rubber cultivation area will go up. The farmer income will also go up, but biodiversity will go down, crop diversity will go down, carbon stocks will go down. Other things may go up again, right? Use of biochemicals or soil erosion. So it's not like one thing goes and that's the rest stays the same. No, other things are also happening. No? And also a lot of, I think, a lot of growing criticism to seeing that, okay, scaling is not good per se, especially if you talk about agriculture is the biggest polluter. It's the biggest reason for loss of biodiversity globally. Here you see a picture of the pollution in the Gulf of Mexico due to the nutrients. So yeah, scaling is not good per se. So we have to be a bit more critical also about, you know, more is better and scaling is always good. The third lesson is the mindset shift. You know? And I think if you look at all these things, I don't think we will really scale innovation successfully if we just try to improve what we're doing now. We really need a paradigm shift and a different way of working. One of the things that we see, what I already said a bit before, is this projectization. This is thinking within projects, strong focus on attribution of outputs and direct effects at the cost of contributing together or focusing on outcomes and indirect effects. No? So these are things that are really being discussed at many levels now. There's really some changes also going on there. But still, this is kind of like a modus operandi that we're coming from and slowly trying to change, right? The other thing is also within those projects, it's often like, okay, we are going to change this, we are going to scale that. But the reality is that governments and the private sectors in countries that we're working in, Bangladesh or Zimbabwe, they are the only ones that can sustain that scale, right? So that graph that we saw in the beginning, the project ended and basically the people left, right? And there's definitely was not enough local buy-in to keep growing that or sustaining that, whatever good was done, right? So it is really a lot about helping local actors position themselves to intervene at large scale. And it's not only about the ability to scale. So there's a lot of programs and training and organizational capacity development, but it's also very much about the willingness of them to scale. No? Sometimes these organizations are part of a project because they want to be part of the project or they think they can benefit from it, but they may see other solutions as much more realistic, no, or much more where they're much more motivated around. So these kind of lessons are all a bit theoretic, of course. No, they're a bit okay. Well, how do you really deal with this in practice? And I think that really is something that I've been focusing on here with my team in Mexico. Is how do you make these things a bit more tangible? How can you deal with this? If we say that scaling is really about the local actors, it's not about the people in the research centers or in the Washingtons and in the other places in Rome to say, okay, well, this is how it should be done. I think it's really important that local actors are able to make sense of scaling in their context. It's so context specific. They have to make their sense of it. So we developed some kind of tools or kind of games, if you want to call it, where you get a bit more of a tangible feeling about it. So it's really about awareness. I think a lot of people just assume scaling is more and they just go ahead and do that without really reflecting on those lessons. Another thing is about really recognizing what scaling is. And since we are in Mexico anyway, we thought, okay, let's draw a Templo Mayor and explain it a little bit according to that. So we say, okay, well, the scaling out, really reaching more with what you're doing. That's what all the projects are kind of like, doing and having their focus on. And then we say, yeah, that's not enough. You also need to think about the scaling up, and that's really transforming these institutional conditions, allowing others also to collaborate with you. Kind of, I think, what you call in the networking around that, or the non-linear scaling, enabling others to scale along with you, right? So that's also happening, and people have examples of that and say, oh, okay, well, if we make that distinction, we see that maybe it's a bit out of balance, right? And then the third one is the scaling deep element. And that's really also where my interest in systems change and system thinking, and also in this group was really fed, because I think that still deserves much more attention. Because to me, that really is the stability of that pyramid, that if the project is over, there is no more funding or the donors go away. If it is not like a new normal for the local people, the people that are using it, it's not part of their routine, then the thing will collapse. No? So we have to pay a lot more attention to scaling deep, the changing of the mindsets around this. And with that, you would have a much more balanced pyramid, as we call it. And so we basically let project teams play with this. Okay, the things that you're doing, are they kind of in balance? Yes or no? And often you see that there's a lot of focus on the scaling out and much less so on the others. Yeah, that scaling deep, of course, well, just in the context of Mexico, I think agriculture, the word culture is in agriculture, very strong in Mexico, where maize is like a divine crop, right? And then I think one of the good things is that also in the last couple of years, 5 years, a lot of tools were made available to think through the scaling process, think through what are important elements in the context that you have to pay attention to. And I've been involved in the development of the scaling scan, where we basically say, okay, scaling only happens if you pay attention to 10 ingredients, right? It's not only about technology attributes and making that better, but it's also about having a value chain, about the policy environment. It's about finance, or what is the level of those ingredients, and how does that help you make go to scale? So we do that, for example, by drawing a barrel with project teams, where we say, okay, draw your barrel, see what of those ingredients scores most, no? And mostly what we see is that people pay a lot of attention to tweaking the technology and making it better, without paying due attention, for example, to the finance environment or policy environment. And we basically let them draw that barrel, and they see, okay, well, imagine now there's water in there. Where is it leaking? And like I said, often it's leaking because didn't think through business models or incentives around that, or the finance. And that's kind of like an aha moment for many people to really refocus a little bit what they're focusing on. Huh? Now, when I was making these lessons, I was also thinking about or the systems thinkers among you will really see, okay, there's a lot of parallels with what people in systems thinking are doing now. So this context, this king lesson, it's really about taking more systems into account, right? I think a narrow start on the innovation, and let's get it out there. I think the thinking around systems thinking is very strong on that, thinking about more systems, right? This idea of scaling as a process, I think also resonates very strongly with systems thinking about, okay, we can make temporary improvements, right? There are no solutions, there are no quick fixes to this. We are in a dynamic environment. What we can do is temporary improvements, right? And then the mindset shift is, I think, this concept of, okay, we the system, right? We are also part of that system, and we're also keeping that in place in a way, and we need to change our ways of working as well. So I recognize a lot of that from those lessons last night when I was making the presentation. As I said, I'm also part of the community of practice on scaling, and this year we paid specific attention to the issue of scaling and systems. And I really invite you to go to the website. I think it's at the end of the presentation. Also, there's a document that we developed, done by Richard Cole, on scaling and systems change. And we had webinars there that you can also have a look at. Really recommend also to read the work of Kevin Starr around this. But let's say four key issues that are described there that we as a scaling community looking at systems change, we're really interested in is, okay, how much of the system needs to be changed now? And how deep do those changes need to be? Yeah, we're talking about incremental change. Are we talking about reforms? Are we talking really about transformation? Right? And those are different. Also, the issue of participation and equity. Who basically decides? And the third point is who drives scaling? And that's also a thing that I think is very important. I work a lot with agronomists that are doing their projects, and yeah, what can we expect from them in terms of systems change? Right, they are very good in that technology and that innovation, but maybe not so much first in the other things. No? But if you're Joe Biden, you probably come at it from the other side, right, where you have the power to change systems. Right, so that who drives the scaling, I think, was something very important and interesting also to look at more. So this is, I think, my last slide. Yes, what is hot now? Again, we have next week our annual meeting of the Community of Practice. I really invite you to join. It's a lot about scaling and systems change. Scaling in systems, scaling to change systems, etc. And the question, okay, how much systems can and should we take into account? And that can is also really important. I think often our ability to understand systems is bigger than the ability for us to act on them. And also what you sometimes see is that how useful is it sometimes to look at all the systems? Right, you will probably never be able to move them. So I think there's also some nice work done by Kevin Starr, where he makes the case, okay, really be selective in what you want to do, but focus on something tangible, like a scalable solution or something that you know is visible and generates interest and motivation. The other topic is scaling and mainstreaming and its capacity to scale, not only of ourselves, but also of the donors, the funders, and also of local organizations that we often want to hand over to, right? So that's an issue that is important. The science of scaling, which is, of course, in my research organization important. How do you make sure that we pay attention to understanding the scaling better and not just assume that it will happen and just, let it be? So how do we deal with the science of scaling in that? And then the issue of scaling deep. And I put here a picture there in the left bottom corner, really inspired by the system innovation guide or canvas on the iceberg with the going from the current to the emerging system, which we used in the context of Central America, where we looked at land restoration and how we go to an emerging system of land restoration, from basically land degradation to land restoration, and the importance of these mental models around that. And you see that there's a big basically a mindset of exploitation of agriculture, and how can you basically solve, or how can you address land degradation issues if you don't address those kind of things, no? So I think having attention to those deeper layers, I think, is something still that is really exciting, and we're really grappling with, no? So thank you so much. This was my presentation. There's some contact information. Really happy to reach out and communicate and discuss with you. As I said, there's a link to the community of practice. We have interesting stuff there as well. And yeah, thank you so much. And over to you, Jos.
Great, thank you very much, Lennart. Interesting stuff. I love the analogy of the seed and the soil. It's such a good one, isn't it? About the context, you know, the individual parts relative to the context. I want to come back to that and talk more in a minute. So I'm going to say a few words about the work that I've done a couple of years ago researching this topic and kind of what's out there. I produced a guide. I just shared the link there in the chat. So just going to say a few words about that. It's really kind of complementing, I mean, it's very much aligned with what Lennart was saying there, but it's a couple of additional things, maybe in trying to clarify some kind of concepts there also. Yeah, I think there's two ways of doing things, right? A kind of linear way and a non-linear way. The linear way is kind of how we do a lot of, when we think about the scaling, the Silicon Valley kind of startup approach. Centralized organization comes up with a bit of a plan. And yeah, they're trying to go somewhere, right? They kind of have that planned out and they're moving through kind of a series of steps to get there. It's professional generated, right? Some people in the organization, they have that plan and they're pushing out products or services, right? Kind of mass producing, trying to produce more of those. And it's kind of working with parts. It's incremental change, it's permissioned. And it's in many ways artificial, right? So I want to come back to that, what Lennart was talking about, kind of organic analogy. So here on this other side is a more nonlinear approach, right? And it's more decentralized. It's not necessarily coming from, it's not driven by some centralized entity. It can be exponential because it's nonlinear. It's more emergent. I'll talk more about that in a minute. It's user generated, working with connections. So, and it's employing network effects. I'll say a little bit about that because Lennart didn't mention it so much. It's permissionless, but like the internet, right? Anybody can put up a website or a server or whatever it is. And the internet is a very interesting example of scaling and how that's scaled by people contributing to it. And it's a lot more kind of organic, this form of this non-linear kind of a growth in the way things develop there. Yeah, so the linear strategy, we approach this scaling issue by simply producing more, really. It's very much, sorry, one second. Yeah, it's very much, we're very familiar with this concept from the industrial age. It's what we have done a lot of. Excuse me. And then the nonlinear approach is actually a lot more about scaling patterns and new ways of doing things, right? Instead of producing more of something, it's about how can we scale a new way of doing things in the system, a new pattern of some kind. And I'd say it's a lot about unlocking potential in the system. Instead of creating something new, instead of creating more, it's about unlocking what's actually already there in some way. And for that reason, it's a lot about how do we actually connect things that already exist in the system. So going back to the original slide, it's not about producing more things, it's about actually producing more connections or more synergies between what already exists in the system. And ultimately, it's about this idea of emergence, I would say, really key concept. So instead of creating more organization projects or pilots, we're looking at the protocols and interrelationships between existing solutions. The protocols can create the synergies between the parts that lead to the emergence of new overall structure of the system, new patterns. So here's a quote from Margaret Wheatley, who captures it very well. She says, when separate local effects connect with each other as networks, then strengthen as communities of practice, suddenly and surprisingly, a new system emerges at a greater level of scale. This system of influence possesses qualities and capacities that were unknown in the individuals. It isn't that they were hidden, they simply didn't exist until the system emerges. They are properties of the system, not the individual. But once there, individuals possess them, and the system that emerges always possesses greater power and influence than is possible through planned incremental change. Emergence is how life creates radical change and takes things to scale. So this is from a really interesting article, actually, by Margaret Wheatley. I'll share a link in the chat afterwards. But it's this, idea of emergence when we're putting things together in new ways, right? Connecting them, creating protocols, creating synergies, and then, as she says, suddenly we get the emergence of kind of a new pattern, a new system, very much like the internet has just so rapidly emerged in our world. And she actually has a theory of change around it, right? Life cycle of emergence. As I say, I'll share the link, but this idea of dispersed networks, when people start to come together in kind of an informal way, if that develops and grows, it can become kind of a community of practice and ultimately a system of influence. But just one more kind of thing I wanted to touch upon is this idea of network effects and how these kind of networks can grow in kind of an organic fashion. So this approach leverages network effects, which is a positive feedback loop, where more people join, the more attractive the community comes to others to join, or a particular way of doing things. So the internet again, or telephone, or social media, things like this, all networks really. For example, the more people that join the internet, the more valuable it will be for the next person to join, because there'll be more options to connect to people. So that can be a kind of endogenous kind of growth mechanism, instead of trying to, that artificial kind of approach to growing, where we produce more of something. This can be actually drive itself, right, in the way that the internet's grown its own development. And it can be also a thing kind of driven by simple rules. When people are connecting peer-to-peer, we should be designing for the endogenous scaling engine. Our emphasis is on providing people with the context to connect and simple rules that motivate sharing and the spreading of ideas or the desirable pattern or behavior in the system. So it's a very different way of looking at it from, I think, as you were saying, Lennart, the way that the president of the United States would be looking at it, Joe Biden, right? He's coming from one perspective, the center of an organization, has a lot of money and so forth. And this is a very different way. It's actually looking at kind of the internal workings of that system and asking how do things grow in that system organically in that sense. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there for now and we'll open it up for discussion. So anybody, you're welcome to unmute yourself and jump in, have a question for myself or for Lennart. Yeah. We have one question here from Murphy. What if the system is dysfunctional and broken? Why not create something new instead of keeping the same system?
Yeah, maybe if I can, that's something that, of course, working in developing countries, it's a frequent issue, no? You're working sometimes with dysfunctional governments, or you're working in fragile states that are even in conflict, right? How do you deal with that? I think one of the things in this kind of work is I think having that focus on the public good again. There has to be, you have to basically work with the system that is there, no? And there are proponents, strong proponents that say, okay, well, swim in the murky waters that there are and find your way around that system, right? But I think with the recent movements into more of a systems thinking within the scaling community, like if we see now, for example, we have the UN Food Systems Summit, the whole agricultural sector where I'm working, it's going much more into a systemic perspective, where I think we're a bit more critical of that look and really seeing that, okay, well, you have to somehow address that system as well in a constructive way, and don't build your parallel systems. I think in the examples of Amazon, of course, that's very different world than dealing with issues like in Ethiopia, for example. Right? So I think those are kind of areas of tension that that especially in developing countries we have to deal with. One of the things that we are seeing, and we're hopefully publishing soon about that, it's submitted, but that still in a lot of these programs, the focus is on individual capacity building, trainings. No? Okay, the people that are interested and motivated, we train them, but there's very less attention to the organizational development. And we see that those individuals, they work in organizations that don't have the capacity or even the means or resources to support the scaling in the future. So again, a call for working a little bit more with the system and really thinking about, okay, what do we leave behind when we leave here? And I think in the past we have been creating too many dependencies on ourselves as the the system shapers or the scalers, and not giving enough power or capacity to the local actors to change that. No? So yeah, it's a long game in that sense, especially in the countries that we are working in. I don't know, maybe other people have some other ideas or experience that I would like to share. Would be interested to hear about that. But that is it's a big issue. Do you swim in the murky waters, or do you wait until the water is clean before you jump in, right? It's often not an option. Yeah.
I think the word that's kind of from a lot of what you're talking about for me that's popping out is like the sustainability of it, isn't it? I don't think you use that word, but I think it's there. When you say it's a process, right? It's going to have to be sustained to get to something that's really of scale, isn't it? And it's only if you're actually supporting growing the context, you're actually really going to get there, isn't it? Because I think that's part of what you're saying. So that graph that you showed, so often it goes like that, and then it comes crashing back down, right? And that's because it gets to kind of a limits of growth or something, isn't it? It's kind of like bacteria in a petri dish, and we're throwing food in, but ultimately they're going to come crashing down unless you're working with the context and growing that exactly as you say. You're thinking about the whole set of interrelated factors in the system that need to, exactly as you say, need to grow as you're scaling that thing. So I mean, I think the problem is that we look at scaling in a artificial, in a decontextualized way, don't we? Like this is just in a petri dish or something, you know, when actually it's in a real context. So maybe you want to say, maybe you could say more about that, like that aspect of sustain. How do you do that? So like I was talking to a lady recently who works with UNDP in Africa, and actually her job is after they've run their program, whatever it is, a year or 3 years, her job is to go in and make sure that it's sustained. I don't know if that's a good job, because you'd actually want it built into what we're talking about here. You want it built into the whole thing, right? Don't you? Not just we're going to do a year's program and then you kind of pick up the things afterwards. But I think that's key to so much of it, isn't it? Like if you really want to get to, you know, that place of really changing a system, you're not going to get there in 1 year or 3 years. It's going to take 10, 20, 30 years, and you have to grow the whole system at the same time. Quick advancements really aren't going to get you there. Can you say anything more about that sustainability aspect of it?
Yeah, I think that's really, again, the difference between, let's say, a Coca-Cola that you know grows a bigger organization that has the ability to scale more. They just become bigger themselves, right? Whereas in where I'm working, that's not desired. We're basically, our job is to get out of a job, right? We shouldn't be there. We should get ourselves out of there, no? So it is really about not getting that high number at the end of the project, but I think the projects push many of us. Let's just show that we can get this high number by December, and then the project is over. We get probably a new project because we did so well, but it defeats the purpose again. So it's really more about slow processes and thinking about, well, projects or activities of 10, 15 years, to achieve these kind of things. So you're thinking about projects as building blocks on each other, one builds on the other, and really looking at what is happening, what is the history of this issue in that country, what has been tried before, and how can you build on that? And I think often people tend to start from scratch again, kind of like the white man's burden, right? If I didn't do it, it's probably not right. Let me take a stab at it. And yeah, it's a lot about attention to the local capacities, I think, for sustainability. And yeah, being very much aware of that. It's not so much getting to that point, but how do you stay on that point and let them even grow it, right?
Yeah, creating that endogenous thing in the system that I was talking about, where it's growing itself. Otherwise, it's going to be very artificial, isn't it? You're going to be continuously, and at a certain stage, the organization is going to, the UN is going to say, we do 3 years and that's it. We've put enough funding in. And then it's going to, if you don't build that endogenous thing in the system, something that's alive in it for it to grow, then it's not going to last that period, is it?
Exactly. We are confronted with this. Well, we learn some hard lessons around that. No, there's, for example, varieties of maize that are really much more resistant to droughts, let's say in Zimbabwe. The thing is that the flavor of that seed was not what, or the consistency of the seed was different. So people couldn't make their zatsa, their traditional dish with it, and then reject it, right? So it's also really about understanding the local needs, what do they want, right? And making sure that yeah, you align with that. So yeah, not coming up with something from outside and just pushing it in and then getting to those high numbers, but really making sure that you are really solving a problem in all its facets.
I think ultimately, yeah, sorry, I'll open up for questions. One second, I just want to say one last word on that. Then it's also, it ultimately kind of goes back to a kind of spiritual thing in the sense of our egos, isn't it? We bring ourselves and our egos to it, and when we come in with our egos, that we don't actually take appreciation of what exists in the system already, do we? We don't take the time to see what's there, and we have a solution, we have a plan, and we push our plan, and it goes like this, and we think we're doing great. But ultimately it degrades the overall system and so forth. So it really starts with that, doesn't it? Like how as individuals and organizations we're showing up. And I think it definitely goes back to that thing of recognizing what's already there. And, it ties into the places where you're working, indigenous knowledge and so forth, that's already there. How do we appreciate that first, understand what's there first, and then try and build upon that and really create something sustainable? Yeah. Okay. So someone had a question there.
Yes, it's actually a comment. So pretty much aligned with what has been mentioned already. So essentially to develop capabilities in the communities, because I think this is what ultimately enables sustainability of programs. So projects, I mean, it is inevitable to promote some kind of development. You need projects because it's a kind of a batch experiment in which you kind of test something, you implement something, and then you scale from there. So projects are inevitable, but I think within the projects, it is essential to include skills development. So skills around, for example, the project management itself, leadership in the community, or the technical skills or technical knowledge that is needed to be able to sustain the projects in the long term. So I think this is part of what is required to ensure that communities can continue their own projects and can even enable something or establish something that is long term. And then the other thing is, I wouldn't look at the current problems in development projects around ego, but rather around kind of like lack of awareness. Because once someone understands the importance of developing grassroots initiatives and growing community-led projects, it is like impossible not to see that again. Therefore, I think it's just an understanding of that. So awareness of those leaders who come with their projects, their initiatives, and their good intentions to develop communities. So yeah, so awareness, and also kind of transform the way systems and development is being seen. So we all have great ideas. So this is probably also another reason why many projects fail, is because there are a lot of experts out there, a lot of people with great ideas on how things can be transformed, how they can be developed. And many of them, in some occasions, are very theoretical. So kind of like it's the first time they're implementing something, and then they think, okay, this is a great opportunity. So I think we should take those ideas as such, as ideas, as experiments, and take the best of them, and again, kind of build capacities in communities, because with skills, you can always scale a system. People will continue to, like, if organizations could focus on people's development, on how they can think for themselves, how they can develop leadership, how they can think critically, how they can plan, how they can put together people, I think it's like the basis for any upscale program in any community.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I was thinking about your reference of if something scales up, something else scales down. And so how do you prevent competitive exclusion? So like what, because I was reading Danella Meadows' book, and she was stating that, you know, you kind of need like regulatory intervention for that. So when you guys are, you know, scaling in these developing countries, like how are you preparing them for, you know, if this system becomes if this system scales very well, how do you prevent that from, you know, impacting other stakeholders in the system?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that's also a very tricky issue, especially where we work with basically public goods, right? And we are developing seeds, for example, right, or varieties of maize or wheat that do better than the local varieties in terms of drought resilience, in terms of yield, in terms of, you know, nowadays we look at all those things. It's great. The flavor is also good, and the workability for the Zaza in Zimbabwe is also kind of taken care of. But yeah, how do you scale that then? You have to scale it through the private sector, like I was saying. It's about the local actors. So you basically, in many of the projects, you give them a kind of like a monopoly, which is not fair, no? So yeah, I think it's kind of like an evil that you use to get the thing started, but you have to make very good agreements that is for a limited period of time. And then those companies cannot, let's say, put how do you say, the rights for that. No, they have to open it up again. So this is really a kind of like a legal issues that go quite far, like you're saying, but all in the sense of, okay, let's get this out there. Let's have local actors scale this. So not us as a project saying, okay, we do this and look how fantastic it works, because you jump into the ocean again. No, it has to be done by those local actors. Yeah, and that's a tricky business. That's definitely a good point that you're raising.
Thank you.
Okay, Joanna, you had a question there?
Yes, it's Joanne from Toronto. My question is on context, or how to take systems, how to take more systems into account. Does that mean putting what you're building into different scenarios, different situations, or different context? Is that the way to scale out? Do you have examples for how we can do that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. That's again a difficult question in that sense. And what I think, well, the first step, and what we're doing, and for example, in that tool that I helped develop, is giving more attention to the context, just very simple. Let's take 10 environmental factors into account: the finance situation, the value chains, the policy environment, the skills and capacity, and look at that in your context. And what we do then, the things that we work globally, so that's nice. So we for example, look at Bangladesh with a similar, let's say, agricultural machinery, like a two-wheel tractor, for example. No? And you see that the context for scaling is very, very different than if you look at the same innovation or same technology in Zimbabwe and in Mexico. We did that. And you, first of all, like somebody else said, it's that awareness that the context is basically determining whether it will scale or not. It's not so much the innovation as such. The innovation is often already at a level where, you know, it's good enough or something. No? So getting that understanding and that's, I think, really the first and very important step. And then the question is, okay, what are you going to do about it? And that's where you get into the really murky waters, because often our team of agronomists, they don't have the capacity to change the financial products for this thing, no? So it's kind of like a shock to them and saying, well, what are we doing if we're not able to fix the real problem? Okay, well, maybe we need to collaborate. No, let's get a microfinance institution in there as a project partner in the scaling phase, or let's have some diversity of people in our teams so that you can also tackle more issues within the context. Again, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the system. So really we're saying, okay, stay close to your thing that you can do well, the thing that you have control over, but go a bit further than you're going now. No, often it's very narrow to that pilot environment, well controlled, that particular innovation. Broaden up, look at what are the supplementary innovations do we need to develop. Okay, in this case, maybe a microfinance solution. Tackle that as well, and then build your case. Don't think you're going to solve this in 3 years. This is a 15, 20-year issue. And maybe in 10 years, you're probably not the project leader anymore because the needs are much different, right? But if you say, I think this innovation is going to help those people, again, what Jos is saying, take your ego away, kind of now, and really think about the outcome, and also be critical if you're really the one that can do that. I don't know if that responds to your question.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. It's very helpful.
Thanks.
So, I mean, you mentioned one word there, the outcome, Lennart, in our previous discussion. I remember you talking about that, scaling the outcome. You didn't mention it so much here. Maybe say a bit about that, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do, isn't it? Scale, instead of scaling our number of products and our number of services, we're trying to scale some outcome in the system. Could you say a little bit more on that? Or?
Yeah, I think I'm bashing a bit my own organization here, but I think it's okay. We're coming from a world where it's a very apparent issue that I work for the Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, and historically, the people that work here are maize and wheat experts. So they go to a village in, again, let's take Zimbabwe for the case, and ask her, what are you doing? Oh, we are hungry. Or, okay, well, we have fantastic maize varieties that yield more, and here you go, no? Okay, let's try this. So we're going at it from an innovation push perspective, because we are experts in maize, so let's give them maize, right? I think now if you look more at the outcome, you would say the outcome is that they're not hungry anymore. And then you work backwards, and then you say, well, most of them are actually growing chicken. That's maybe the most important thing. So I don't have any knowledge about chicken, but maybe we should allow that also to happen, right? Or there are other things that they have, I don't know, no saving systems or whatever, right? And then, yes, maize is also part of the solution, but it's not only the only solution. So I think it helps a lot to think more about the outcome. Again, it pushes a bit away your own ego and your innovation silver bullet concept. No? So I don't know if that's a good example or that helps, Jos.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think the other thing that's popping up for me is the problem with the boxes too, isn't it? Like you're talking about your agronomists, and obviously they have a training and they they consider themselves agronomists, but you're saying actually the problem may be way outside their box, right?
Yeah.
And then that does really get into the systems innovation, systems change stuff about bringing different actors across the whole system together, and creating those spaces and platforms. And does the organization see itself like that? Like your organization, for example, is it able to see itself like that, or does it stay in its own kind of identity? And I guess going back to the ego thing, own confines and identity that we're, you know, maize and wheat, and this is what we do. It's not our job to kind of figure out who are the finance people we need and what's all of these parts. So that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Actually getting outside of the boxes and creating those spaces for bringing things together in the way that's needed.
Yeah, no, this has been an issue for debate for many years, and this year and last year and next year we're going through a major reform to unite all those different crop specific research centers into one big global organization. And I think yesterday even Bill Gates pledged another $500 million for that. So it is really happening, and really people are promoting that, so that we can work much more easily with other people that may have the chicken solution, right? At the same time. So it is a big issue, and it is happening. I think this drive from, let's say, agriculture to food systems, that whole global movement has been really helpful in that, in people seeing and being interested in things like systems change and in scaling. We see a lot more interest than 3-4 years ago. So yeah, I'm very hopeful that that we're going in the right direction there, in terms of collaborating better, in terms of looking more at the outcomes, and yeah, taking a bit more of a systems perspective and those kind of things. And again, I think also seeing the need for partnerships and collaborations with maybe the non-usual suspects, right? That really help the case forward. So yeah, I am positive.
Great, thank you very much, Lennart. I think we really unpacked some of the key points here today. And great to have this conversation. I just shared a paper Lennart co-authored there, scaling from reaching many to sustainable systems change at scale, a critical shift in mindset. So you can take a look at that. We're going to wrap up now. We'll come to the end of the hour. It was really good having this conversation. I could definitely stay going. It's a topic of, you know, that whole question of how do we sustain the innovation? Like, isn't that the most important question? Because you're not going to do anything in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. If we can't sustain this, we're definitely not going to change systems. So I see this as such a key topic we should be talking about. It's been really good to start this conversation. And also you have there in the chat the guide we produced. You can take a look at that. And yeah, we leave it there for now. Thank you very much for joining. Lennart, we have another event coming up next week with our London hub on systems mapping. So I hope to see you all then. And until that time, take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great